Colonel Sarah Chun stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the pristine landing pad of the Galactic Military Academy. The artificial gravity felt lighter than what she was used to on combat stations, and the air tasted too clean. She adjusted the strap of her worn duffel bag and looked around at the towering spires of glass and metal that housed the most prestigious military institution in known space. Everything here gleamed. The walkways were spotless, the buildings were perfectly maintained, and even the cadets she could see in the distance moved with practiced precision. It was nothing like the battle-scarred ships and makeshift bases she had called home for the past 15 years. Sarah had fought in the Outer Rim Wars, survived the siege of Kepler Station, and led the desperate defense of the mining colony Beta 7 when 3 alien fleets had tried to break humanity's expansion into the galaxy. She had scars on her arms from plasma burns and a slight limp from shrapnel that had torn through her leg during the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. Her service record was longer than most officers' entire careers. But here at the Academy, none of that seemed to matter. "Excuse me, are you lost?" A young voice called out behind her. Sarah turned to see a cadet approaching. The boy couldn't have been more than 20, with perfectly pressed uniform and boots so polished they reflected the afternoon sun. His name tag read Cadet Morrison, and he had the confident stride of someone who had never been shot at. "I'm looking for the administration building," Sarah said simply. The cadet looked her up and down, taking in her civilian clothes and weathered appearance. His expression shifted from helpful to slightly condescending. "Are you here for the maintenance staff orientation? I think that's in Building C, not the main admin center." Sarah felt a familiar twinge of irritation, but kept her expression neutral. "No, I'm reporting for duty. Colonel Sarah Chun, your new instructor." The cadet's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize the admin building is that way." He pointed toward the largest structure. "You want to check in with Dean Ashworth." As Sarah walked away, she heard the cadet speaking into his comm device. "Hey, Jake, you're not going to believe this. They just assigned some old lady as an instructor. She looks like she's been living in a scrapyard." Sarah smiled grimly. If they thought she looked rough now, they had no idea what was coming. The administration building was as impressive inside as it was outside. Marble floors stretched across vast lobbies, and holographic displays showed the Academy's proud history. Portraits of famous graduates lined the walls. Admirals, generals, and heroes who had shaped the course of human expansion across the stars. Dean Marcus Ashworth was a tall, thin man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent more time in boardrooms than battle zones. His office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Academy grounds. When Sarah entered, he barely looked up from his desk. "Colonel Chun, I presume?" His voice was crisp and businesslike. "Please have a seat." Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs across from his desk and waited. The dean continued reading for several more minutes before finally setting down his tablet and looking at her properly. "I'll be honest, Colonel. Your assignment here was not my idea. The board of directors felt that we needed more practical experience among our faculty." He said the words as if they tasted bad. "However, I run this academy according to certain standards. Our cadets come from the finest families in human space, and they expect instruction from officers who understand the proper way of conducting military operations." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "In what way is that, Dean Ashworth?" "The traditional way. By the book. These young people will one day command fleets and lead armies. They need to understand strategy, logistics, and leadership theory. Not." He gestured vaguely in her direction. "Whatever it is you did out there in those frontier skirmishes. Those frontier skirmishes kept humanity from being wiped out 3 times over," Sarah said quietly. "Yes. Well, that's neither here nor there. You'll be teaching basic combat operations to first-year cadets. It's a simple curriculum, mostly classroom work covering standard engagement protocols and basic tactics. I trust you can handle that without turning it into some sort of war story session." Sarah stood up. "Where's my classroom?" "Building 7, room 204. Your first class is tomorrow at 0800 hours. Try not to traumatize the students on your first day. As Sarah left the office, she could hear Dean Ashworth already on his comm device, speaking in low, irritated tones to someone about the new hire from the frontier. Building 7 was older than the main structures, with concrete walls and smaller windows. Room 204 was on the second floor, a standard classroom with rows of desks facing a smartboard at the front. Sarah walked to the instructor's desk and set down her bag. On the surface was a tablet containing her class roster and the approved curriculum. She scrolled through the names. Most of them had multiple surnames connected by hyphens, indicating noble families or wealthy merchant dynasties. Alexander Worthington Hayes III, Miranda Blackstone Vance, Jonathan Sterling Cross. These weren't kids who had grown up wondering if they'd have enough food for dinner or if pirates would raid their colony in the night. The curriculum was exactly what Dean Ashworth had described: basic theory, historical examples, and standardized procedures. It was the kind of material that would prepare someone to serve as a junior officer on a peacekeeping mission or an exploration vessel. It wouldn't prepare them for real war. Sarah spent the evening in her assigned quarters, a small but comfortable room in the faculty housing complex. She reviewed the materials and thought about her first day. She had been in worse situations before. During the siege of Kepler Station, she had held the command center for 18 hours straight, while enemy forces tried to break through. She could handle a classroom full of spoiled cadets. The next morning, she arrived at her classroom 15 minutes early. The cadets began filing in at 0755, chatting quietly among themselves. They all wore the Academy's blue and gold uniform, and their appearance was immaculate. Sarah watched from behind the instructor's desk as they took their seats. She recognized the cadet from the landing pad, Morrison, sitting in the second row. He whispered something to the girl next to him, and they both glanced at Sarah before looking away quickly. At exactly 0800, Sarah stood up. "Good morning, cadets. I am Colonel Sarah Chun, and I'll be your instructor for basic combat operations." A hand shot up immediately. Sarah nodded at the cadet, a blonde girl in the front row whose name tag read Blackstone Vance. "Colonel Chun, I've reviewed your service record, and I notice you never attended the academy yourself. How can we be sure you're qualified to teach academy-level courses?" The classroom went silent. Sarah could feel 30 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. In the back of the room, she noticed a few cadets smirking, as if they were enjoying the show. "That's a fair question, Cadet Blackstone Vance," Sarah said calmly. "You're right that I never attended the academy. I enlisted in the Colonial Defense Force when I was 18 and learned my trade in the field. Perhaps you could tell me what qualifications you think are more important for a combat instructor: classroom theory or actual combat experience?" The cadet's face reddened slightly. "Well, obviously both are important, but proper military education provides a foundation that how many of you have been in actual combat?" Sarah interrupted, looking around the classroom. Silence. "How many of you have even been off-world?" A few hands went up hesitantly. "How many of you have seen someone die?" The silence was complete now. Sarah could hear the air circulation system humming softly in the background. "I see. Well, let me tell you what I learned in my 15 years of service that might be relevant to this class." Sarah moved away from the desk and began pacing slowly in front of the room. "I learned that when enemy ships are shooting at you, proper protocol matters a lot less than keeping your crew alive. I learned that sometimes the book is wrong, and sometimes following orders will get everyone killed. I learned that real leadership isn't about commanding respect. It's about earning it." She stopped pacing and looked directly at Blackstone Vance. "I also learned that the universe doesn't care about your family name or your trust fund when the shooting starts. Out there, the only thing that matters is whether you can do the job." Another cadet raised his hand. "Morrison, with all due respect, Colonel, combat operations have evolved significantly since your time in the field. Modern warfare is more sophisticated, more technological. The strategies you used against frontier raiders might not apply to contemporary military doctrine." Sarah smiled, and Several cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was something about that smile that suggested they might not like what came next. Cadet Morrison, since you seem to be an expert on modern warfare, perhaps you could walk us through the proper procedure for defending a space station against a numerically superior enemy force. Morrison straightened in his chair, clearly pleased to demonstrate his knowledge. According to standard defensive protocols, you would establish a perimeter using long-range sensors, deploy defensive satellites in a grid pattern, and coordinate with fleet elements to create overlapping fields of fire. The key is maintaining communication links and following the chain of command to ensure proper resource allocation. Textbook perfect, Sarah said. Now let me tell you what actually happened during the siege of Kepler Station. 3 enemy fleets jumped into the system simultaneously, using a coordinated attack pattern that bypassed our outer defenses entirely. Our long-range sensors were jammed within the first 5 minutes. Half our defensive satellites were destroyed before they could fire a shot. The fleet elements you mentioned were scattered across 3 systems and couldn't reach us for 6 hours. The classroom was completely quiet now. Sarah moved to the smartboard and began drawing a simple diagram. We had 1,200 people on that station, military personnel, civilian contractors, families. The enemy force was roughly 3,000 strong, with superior firepower and numerical advantage. According to your textbook, we should have surrendered immediately to minimize casualties. She finished her diagram and turned back to the class. Instead, we held the station for 18 hours. We used maintenance tunnels to stage guerrilla attacks. We jury-rigged mining charges as improvised weapons. We turned the station's loading docks into bunkers and used civilian cargo haulers as decoy targets. By the time the relief fleet arrived, we had destroyed or disabled 11 enemy ships and inflicted casualties they hadn't expected. Morrison was staring at the diagram, his earlier confidence evaporating. How many casualties did you take? 43 killed, 112 wounded. That's roughly 12% losses while facing an enemy that should have overwhelmed us in minutes. Sarah set down the marker and looked around the room. The strategy that saved those lives wasn't in any textbook. It came from 15 years of learning to improvise, adapt, and survive when everything goes wrong. She returned to her desk and picked up the curriculum tablet. This course is supposed to teach you basic combat operations. According to this approved material, we're going to spend the next 16 weeks discussing theoretical scenarios and memorizing procedures that assume everything goes according to plan. But real combat operations are what happen when nothing goes according to plan. A cadet in the middle of the room raised his hand tentatively. What are you suggesting, Colonel? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. I'm suggesting that if you want to learn how to keep people alive when someone is trying to kill them, you might want to pay attention to someone who has actually done it. The rest of the class passed in relative quiet as Sarah went through the official curriculum, explaining the basic concepts of space combat and planetary assault operations. But she could see that the cadets were thinking about what she had said. Some of them looked skeptical, others thoughtful. A few seemed intrigued. When the class ended, most of the students filed out quickly, but Morrison lingered behind. He approached Sarah's desk hesitantly. Colonel Chun, I wanted to apologize for what I said yesterday at the landing pad. I shouldn't have assumed. Forget it, cadet. First impressions are usually wrong anyway. Morrison nodded and started to leave, then turned back. Can I ask you something? At Kepler Station, were you scared? Sarah considered the question seriously. Terrified, but being scared doesn't matter as much as what you do about it. What did you do about it? I did my job. That's all anyone can do. After Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in the empty classroom for several minutes. Through the windows, she could see other classes in session, cadets in perfectly organized rows, instructors lecturing from prepared materials. Everything neat, orderly, predictable. She thought about the dean's words about proper military education and understanding the traditional way. She thought about the cadets' reactions to her stories, their mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Most of all, She thought about the gap between what these young people were learning and what they would actually need to know if humanity found itself in another war. Because another war was coming. Sarah could feel it in her bones, the same way she had always been able to sense when an enemy attack was imminent. Intelligence reports from the frontier were incomplete and contradictory, but there were signs. Ships disappearing in deep space. Communications blackouts in border systems. The kind of patterns that preceded every major conflict she had ever experienced. These cadets would graduate in 3 years and receive their commissions as junior officers. If she was right about the timeline, they would be the ones leading squads and commanding ships when the next war began. They would be responsible for the lives of thousands of people who were counting on them to know more than just textbook theory. Sarah picked up her bag and headed for the door. Tomorrow she would teach them about logistics and supply chain management. The day after that, communications protocols. All important topics, all covered thoroughly in the approved curriculum. But she was also going to teach them things that weren't in any textbook. Things about leadership under pressure, about making impossible decisions with incomplete information, about the weight of responsibility when lives hang in the balance. She was going to prepare them for the reality of combat, whether Dean Ashworth liked it or not. As she walked across the academy grounds, Sarah noticed more cadets pointing at her and whispering among themselves. Word was spreading about the new instructor who had actually been in real battles. Some of them looked at her with curiosity, others with skepticism. A few seemed almost hostile, as if her presence was somehow threatening to their ordered world. That evening, Sarah received a message on her personal comm device. It was from Admiral Rebecca Martinez, her former commanding officer, and one of the few people in the military hierarchy who understood what was really happening on the frontier. Sarah, how's academy life treating you? I hope you're not going too easy on those kids. Something big is brewing out here, and they're going to need every advantage they can get. The politicians are still pretending everything is fine, but we both know better. Train them hard. They'll thank you for it later, if they survive long enough. Sarah deleted the message and stared out her window at the academy's manicure grounds. In the distance, she could see cadets practicing parade formations, their movements precise and coordinated. It was beautiful in its own way, a testament to human discipline and organization. But discipline and organization wouldn't be enough for what was coming. These young people needed something more. They needed the kind of hard-earned wisdom that only came from surviving real combat, from making life and death decisions under impossible pressure, from learning that sometimes the right choice was the one that kept the most people alive, regardless of what the regulations said. Sarah Chun had spent 15 years learning those lessons the hard way. Now she had 3 years to pass them on to a new generation of officers. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. The next phase of her mission was about to begin. 3 weeks into the semester, Sarah had settled into an uncomfortable routine. She taught the approved curriculum during class time, covering defensive formations and basic tactical theory, while watching her students take notes with the mechanical precision of data recorders. But the real education was happening after hours. It started with Morrison. 2 days after their first conversation, he had approached Sarah after class with a question about supply line vulnerabilities that went far beyond anything in the standard materials. Then, Blackstone Vance had lingered behind to ask about leadership during crisis situations. Soon, a small group of cadets were staying after each class, hungry for the kind of practical knowledge they weren't getting anywhere else. Sarah found herself walking a careful line. Dean Ashworth had made it clear that deviation from the approved curriculum would not be tolerated, but her students needed more than theoretical knowledge. She began incorporating real-world scenarios into her lessons, disguising practical combat experience as case studies and historical analysis. The breakthrough came during a lesson on defensive positioning. Sarah was explaining standard perimeter protocols when Cadet Torres, a quiet young man from the Mars colonies, raised his hand. Colonel Chun, these formations assume the enemy will approach from predictable vectors. But What if they don't follow conventional attack patterns? What if they're willing to take heavy losses to achieve breakthrough? Sarah paused, recognizing something in Torres's voice that the other cadets hadn't shown. Have you seen unconventional tactics before, cadet? Torres hesitated, then nodded. My home colony was raided twice before I came to the academy. The attackers didn't care about minimizing losses. They just wanted to break through fast and grab what they could before reinforcements arrived. The classroom fell silent. Most of these cadets had grown up in the safe, established systems of the inner worlds. Torres's experience was as foreign to them as Sarah's had been. Tell us about it, Sarah said quietly. Torres looked around the room uncertainly. I don't think it's relevant to the curriculum. Everything is relevant if it helps us understand how combat actually works. Go ahead. Torres took a deep breath. The first raid happened when I was 14. Our colony had maybe 300 people, mostly miners and their families. We had a small security force, 10 officers with light weapons, and 1 patrol ship. Standard defensive doctrine said we should establish a perimeter around the main settlement and call for help. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But the raiders came in fast and hard, using stripped-down fighters that were barely more than engines with guns attached. They didn't care about taking casualties. Half of them were destroyed in the first pass, but the survivors punched through our perimeter and landed assault teams right in the middle of town. Sarah could see the other cadets leaning forward, their textbook certainties beginning to crack. What did your security force do? They tried to follow procedure, established defensive positions, called for backup, attempted to coordinate a counterattack. It should have worked. Torres's voice was bitter. But the raiders weren't playing by the same rules. They used our own people as human shields, set fire to the residential areas to create chaos, and kept moving so fast that our people couldn't get organized. Blackstone Vance raised her hand. But surely the backup arrived in time. Torres shook his head. Nearest military post was 6 hours away. The raid was over in 20 minutes. They took whatever they could carry and left. 12 people died, including my younger sister. The silence in the classroom was profound. Sarah could see the shock on the cadets' faces as they processed what Torres had described. These weren't the clean, orderly conflicts described in their textbooks. This was the ugly reality of frontier warfare. What happened during the second raid? Sarah asked. Torres's expression hardened. That time, we were ready. My father and some of the other colonists had been thinking about what went wrong the first time. When the raiders came back 6 months later, we didn't try to establish a perimeter. Instead, we evacuated the civilians to the mining tunnels and turned the settlement itself into a trap. He stood up and moved to the smartboard, sketching a rough diagram. We rigged explosives in the buildings they would want to loot. We positioned our defenders in concealed positions with overlapping fields of fire. And we made sure there was only one way out, through a kill zone we had prepared in advance. Sarah watched approvingly as Torres outlined the tactics. How did it work? Better than anyone expected. The raiders landed in the same area as before, expecting easy pickings. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a maze of burning buildings with explosives going off around them. Our security force hit them from 3 directions at once, and this time we had civilians with mining charges acting as improvised artillery. Torres finished his diagram and turned back to the class. We destroyed 8 out of 10 raider ships and captured most of their ground forces. Total casualties on our side: 3 wounded, none killed. After that, word got around that our colony wasn't an easy target. We never had another raid. The classroom erupted in discussion as the cadets began asking Torres questions about tactics, casualties, and decision-making under pressure. Sarah let them talk for several minutes before calling for order. What can we learn from Cadet Torres's experience? She asked. Morrison raised his hand. That standard doctrine doesn't always work against unconventional enemies. Partially correct. What else? Blackstone Vance spoke up. That sometimes you have to be willing to take risks that go against procedure. Also correct. Anything else? A cadet in the back row, Jenkins, raised his hand tentatively. That real leadership means protecting your people, even if you have to break the rules to do it. Sarah smiled. Now you're getting it. The most important lesson here is that doctrine and procedure are tools, not laws. They work when the situation matches the assumptions they're based on. But when those assumptions are wrong, blindly following doctrine will get people killed. She moved to the front of the classroom. Torres's father understood something that many military commanders don't. The enemy gets a vote in how the battle unfolds. You can't force them to fight the way your textbooks say they should. You have to adapt to what they actually do, not what you expect them to do. The discussion continued for the rest of the class period, with cadets sharing their own experiences and asking increasingly sophisticated questions about tactical flexibility and command decision-making. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by their curiosity and intelligence. These young people had the potential to be exceptional officers if they could learn to think beyond the rigid structures they had been taught. As the class ended, Sarah noticed Dean Ashworth standing in the doorway. He had been watching for several minutes, his expression growing more disapproving by the moment. After the cadets filed out, he approached Sarah's desk. "Colonel Chun, I couldn't help but notice that your class has become quite animated recently. I trust you're keeping them focused on the approved curriculum." Sarah began packing her materials. "I'm teaching them combat operations, Dean Ashworth. Sometimes that requires discussing real examples." "Real examples, yes. But I heard one of your students discussing raids and explosives and what sounded suspiciously like guerrilla warfare. That's hardly appropriate for first-year cadets." "Why not? If they're going to be officers, they need to understand all forms of combat, not just the ones that look good in training simulations." Ashworth's voice grew cold. "Colonel, these cadets will be serving in the established fleet, protecting civilized systems from external threats. They won't be fighting off pirates and raiders like some kind of frontier militia. They need proper military education, not war stories from the Outer Rim." Sarah looked at him steadily. "And what happens when the next war doesn't follow proper military protocol? What happens when they face an enemy that doesn't care about civilized rules of engagement? That's a hypothetical situation that is extremely unlikely to occur. Human space is more secure now than it has ever been." Sarah almost laughed. The dean's confidence would have been admirable if it wasn't so dangerous. "Dean Ashworth, with respect, security isn't something you achieve permanently. It's something you maintain through constant vigilance and preparation. These cadets need to understand that. What these cadets need is discipline, order, and respect for established procedures, not encouragement to break rules and disregard authority." Ashworth straightened his uniform jacket. "I'll be observing your classes more closely going forward. Please ensure that your teaching methods align with academy standards." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the empty classroom, thinking about the conversation. She understood Ashworth's perspective, even if she disagreed with it. The academy was designed to produce officers for a peaceful, orderly military focused on exploration and defense. The kind of chaotic, desperate warfare she had experienced on the frontier was supposed to be a thing of the past. But Sarah's instincts told her otherwise. The intelligence reports she had seen before leaving active duty painted a troubling picture. Several human colonies had gone silent in recent months. Long-range patrols were reporting strange readings at the edge of known space. There were signs of organized activity beyond the frontier that suggested humanity might soon face a threat unlike anything they had encountered before. That evening, Sarah received another encrypted message, this time from Captain David Park, her former intelligence officer. The message was brief, but alarming. "Sarah, the situation is worse than we thought. 3 more colonies have gone dark in the Epsilon sector. Whatever is out there, it's moving closer to the core systems. Your cadets need to be ready for anything. Time is running out." Sarah deleted the message and stared at her reflection in the window. Outside, the academy grounds were peaceful and well-lit, with cadets moving between buildings in orderly groups. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, unmarked by any sign of the danger gathering beyond humanity's borders. She made a decision. academy regulations, and Dean Ashworth's disapproval would have to take second place to preparing these young people for what was coming. If she was going to be censured or dismissed, so be it. The important thing was giving them the tools they would need to survive. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her classroom early and rearranged the desks into small groups instead of traditional rows. When the cadets arrived, they looked puzzled by the new configuration. "Today we're going to do something different," Sarah announced once everyone was seated. "Instead of covering Chapter 7 of your textbook, we're going to run a practical exercise. I'm going to give you a scenario, and you're going to work in teams to develop a response." She moved to the smartboard and began outlining the situation. "You're the commanding officer of a heavy cruiser on patrol in the outer systems. Your ship has a crew of 800 and carries a full complement of fighters and assault shuttles. You receive a distress signal from a civilian research station that is under attack by unknown hostile forces." The cadets began taking notes as Sarah continued. "The station has approximately 50 personnel, including civilians and a small security detachment. Long-range sensors indicate at least 3 enemy ships in the area, but their configuration and capabilities are unknown. The nearest fleet assets are 4 hours away. Your orders are to investigate and render assistance." Torres raised his hand. "What's our ship's combat readiness status?" "Full combat readiness. All weapons and defensive systems are operational, and your crew is well-trained and experienced." Blackstone Vance asked, "Do we have any intelligence about the enemy forces? Ship types, weapons, tactical preferences?" "None. This is the first contact with this particular enemy. You'll have to make decisions based on what you observe when you arrive." Morrison looked puzzled. "Colonel, this doesn't sound like any of the scenarios in our textbook. Usually we're given detailed intelligence briefings and specific tactical parameters." Sarah smiled. "That's the point, cadet. Real combat situations rarely come with detailed briefings and specific parameters. You have to work with incomplete information and adapt as the situation develops." She gave them 30 minutes to develop their response plans, moving between the groups and listening to their discussions. The conversations were intense and focused, with cadets debating everything from approach vectors to rules of engagement. Sarah was pleased to see that they were thinking creatively and asking the right kinds of questions. When time was up, she called for each group to present their plan. The first group, led by Blackstone Vance, proposed a cautious approach with long-range reconnaissance before committing to combat. "We would jump in at the edge of the system and deploy sensor drones to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities," Blackstone Vance explained. "Once we have a clear picture of what we're facing, we can develop an appropriate tactical response." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Solid reasoning. What's your timeline for this approach?" "Approximately 90 minutes for reconnaissance and analysis, then another 30 minutes to position our forces for optimal engagement. 2 hours total. What happens to the research station during that time?" The group exchanged glances. They hadn't considered the human cost of their cautious approach. We assume they can hold out until we're ready to act." Dangerous assumption. Next group. The second group, led by Morrison, proposed an aggressive direct assault. "We jump in close to the research station and engage the enemy immediately. Use our superior firepower to drive them off or destroy them." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What if they're stronger than you expected? What if it's a trap?" Morrison looked less confident. "We would adapt our tactics based on what we encounter. With your ship potentially damaged and your crew at risk, that's a lot of adaptation to do in the middle of a firefight." The third group, led by Torres, had developed a more nuanced approach. "We propose a split response. Send our fighter squadron ahead for immediate reconnaissance and limited engagement while the main ship approaches from an unexpected vector. The fighters can provide real-time intelligence and buy time for the civilians while we position for a decisive strike." Sarah was impressed. "Interesting. What are the risks with this approach? If the enemy has significant anti-fighter capabilities, we could lose our squadron before gathering useful intelligence. But the research station personnel have the best chance of survival, and We retain maximum tactical flexibility for the main engagement. Well-reasoned. You're balancing multiple objectives and accepting calculated risks. That's good command thinking. She turned to address the entire class. What can we learn from this exercise? Anyone? Jenkins raised his hand. That there's no perfect solution. Every choice involves trade-offs between different objectives. Exactly. In real combat, you're never choosing between good and bad options. You're choosing between different types of bad options and trying to find the one that achieves your primary mission while minimizing unacceptable losses. Torres added, and that time pressure makes everything harder. In a textbook scenario, you have as long as you want to analyze the situation. In reality, people are dying while you're thinking. Outstanding insight, Cadet Torres. The enemy doesn't wait for you to finish your analysis. Every minute you spend planning is a minute they spend acting. The discussion continued for the rest of the class period, with cadets exploring concepts like acceptable losses, mission priority, and command responsibility under pressure. Sarah could see them beginning to grasp the complexity of real military decision-making, the weight of choices that could mean life or death for hundreds of people. As the class ended, Blackstone Vance approached Sarah's desk. "Colonel, that exercise was unlike anything we've done in our other classes. It felt real." That was the point. How did it make you feel? Blackstone Vance considered the question. Overwhelmed at first, then excited. It was challenging in a way that memorizing doctrine isn't. Command is overwhelming, especially when lives are at stake. The key is learning to function effectively despite that feeling, not waiting for it to go away. Morrison joined the conversation. "Will we be doing more exercises like this?" Sarah looked at both cadets seriously. "That depends on whether you think it's valuable. Learning to think under pressure and make decisions with incomplete information isn't part of the standard curriculum. If you want this kind of training, it would have to be unofficial." Torres had overheard the conversation and approached the group. "Unofficial how?" Sarah glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone. "Evening sessions, optional attendance, practical scenarios, and decision-making exercises that prepare you for situations that might not be covered in your regular classes." The three cadets exchanged glances. Sarah could see the excitement in their faces, the hunger for something more challenging than their standard coursework. "When do we start?" Torres asked. Sarah smiled. "Tomorrow night, 1900 hours. Building 7, room 118. But understand, this is between us. The Academy administration might not approve of supplemental training that goes beyond approved curriculum." As the cadets left, Sarah began planning her first unofficial evening session. She would start with basic situational awareness and crisis decision-making, then gradually build up to more complex scenarios involving multiple objectives and time pressure. She thought about Dean Ashworth's warning about following Academy standards. What she was planning would definitely violate his interpretation of proper curriculum. But Sarah had spent too many years watching good people die because of inadequate training to let bureaucratic concerns override her responsibility to these young officers. If humanity was heading toward another war, these cadets would need every advantage she could give them. The Academy might train them to be proper officers, but Sarah Chan was going to teach them to be survivors. 6 months after Sarah's arrival at the Academy, her evening training sessions had grown from 3 cadets to nearly 30. Word had spread quietly through the student body about the instructor who taught real combat skills, and every week brought new faces to room 118. Sarah had to move the sessions to a larger space and develop increasingly sophisticated scenarios to challenge her growing group of unofficial students. The cadets called themselves Chen's Commandos, though never where faculty members might hear. They had developed their own culture of practical learning, sharing experiences and insights that went far beyond anything in the official curriculum. Sarah was proud of their progress, but she was also aware that their activities were attracting unwanted attention. Dean Ashworth had begun making surprise visits to her regular classes, taking notes, and asking pointed questions about her teaching methods. Other faculty members whispered in the corridors about the irregular instructor who was filling students' heads with dangerous ideas. The pressure was building, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before someone forced a confrontation. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Sarah was conducting a routine lesson on communications protocol when her classroom door burst open. A young lieutenant in a fleet uniform stumbled in, his face pale with exhaustion and stress. "I need to speak with Colonel Chan immediately," he gasped, ignoring the startled cadets. Sarah recognized him as Lieutenant Walsh, one of Admiral Martinez's staff officers. His presence at the academy could only mean one thing. The war everyone had been dreading was finally beginning. "Cadets, you're dismissed for today. Study Chapter 12 for tomorrow's class," Sarah said calmly, though her heart was racing. As the students filed out, exchanging worried glances, Walsh approached her desk. "Colonel, I have orders from Admiral Martinez. You're to report for active duty immediately. Transport leaves in 2 hours. What's the situation, Lieutenant?" Walsh glanced around to make sure the classroom was empty before responding. 3 systems in the outer rim have gone completely dark. No communications, no traffic, nothing. When the fleet sent reconnaissance ships to investigate, they found the colonies completely destroyed. Not just attacked, obliterated. Entire populations wiped out. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. Survivors? None found so far. Whatever did this is unlike anything we've faced before. They're not taking prisoners or resources. They're just killing everything. Any contact with the enemy? One patrol ship managed to transmit data before it was destroyed. The enemy ships are massive, larger than anything in our fleet, and they use weapons technology we don't understand. Plasma-based, but far more powerful than anything we have. Sarah was already moving, gathering her personal items, and thinking about what this meant for her cadets. "Have you notified the Academy administration?" Walsh nodded grimly. "Dean Ashworth has been briefed, but he's convinced this is a localized threat that won't affect the inner systems. He wants to maintain normal operations to avoid panic." "Fool," Sarah muttered under her breath. "What does Admiral Martinez want me to do?" "Report to the Prometheus for immediate deployment to the frontier. You'll be serving as tactical advisor for the defensive fleet being assembled at Kepler Station." Sarah paused in her packing. Kepler Station, the same place where she had held the line against impossible odds 15 years earlier. History was repeating itself, but this time the stakes were potentially much higher. "Lieutenant, I need 15 minutes to handle something before I leave." "Can you wait that long?" Walsh looked puzzled but nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but the transport dash will wait. This is important." Sarah left Walsh in the classroom and hurried across the academy grounds to Building 7. The evening training session wasn't scheduled to begin for several hours, but she knew where to find her most dedicated students. Torres, Morrison, and Blackstone Vance often spent their free time in the tactical simulation lab, working through scenarios she had taught them. She found all 3 huddled around a computer terminal, analyzing the results of a complex multi-ship engagement they had been practicing. They looked up in surprise when she entered. "Colonel, we weren't expecting you until tonight," Morrison said. "Change of plans. I've been called back to active duty. The war we've been preparing for has begun." The 3 cadets exchanged worried glances. "How bad is it?" Torres asked. Sarah considered how much to tell them. They deserved the truth, but she also didn't want to cause panic. Bad enough that they need every experienced officer they can find. "I'll be leaving within the hour." Blackstone Vance stood up abruptly. "Take us with you." "What? Take us with you?" she repeated. "We're almost finished with our first year, and you've taught us more about real combat than anyone else at this academy. We can be useful." Sarah shook her head. "You're cadets. You haven't even completed basic training, let alone dash." "With respect, Colonel," Torres interrupted, "basic training won't matter if this enemy is as dangerous as you think it is. We've learned more from your evening sessions than from all our other classes combined. If the fleet needs people who can think creatively and adapt under pressure, we're ready." Morrison nodded agreement. You've been telling us that real combat is nothing like the textbooks. This is our chance to prove we've been listening." Sarah looked at the three young faces staring at her with determination and barely concealed fear. They were asking her to take them into mortal danger, to throw away their safe academy careers for a chance to face an unknown enemy in actual combat. Everything about it was against regulations, contrary to proper procedure, and completely insane. It was also exactly the kind of thinking she had been trying to teach them. "I can't officially take cadets into a combat zone," she said slowly. "But if three promising young officers happen to volunteer for emergency service and were accepted based on their exceptional qualifications." Torres grinned. "What kind of qualifications would they need?" "Advanced tactical training, crisis decision-making skills, and the ability to function under extreme pressure. The kind of things that might be learned in, say, intensive evening training sessions with a veteran combat officer." Blackstone Vance was already moving toward the door. "How long do we have to pack?" "1 hour. Meet me at the transport pad with basic gear only. And understand, once we leave this academy, there's no guarantee any of us will be coming back." Morrison's expression was serious. "We understand, Colonel. This is what we've been training for." As the three cadets hurried off to prepare, Sarah made her way back to the classroom where Lieutenant Walsh was waiting impatiently. On the way, she composed a brief message to the other members of her evening training group, explaining that the sessions were suspended indefinitely due to her reassignment. She didn't mention the real reason for her departure. There would be time for explanations later, if any of them survived. Walsh looked relieved when she returned. "Ready to go, Colonel?" "Almost. 3 volunteer officers will be accompanying us. Highly trained specialists with advanced tactical qualifications." Walsh raised an eyebrow, but didn't question her description. In the chaos of mobilization, 3 extra officers with special training would be welcomed regardless of their exact background. An hour later, Sarah stood on the academy's landing pad with her 3 former cadets, waiting for the transport that would take them to war. They had traded their academy uniforms for standard fleet gear, and their expressions showed a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reminded Sarah of her own first deployment 20 years earlier. Dean Ashworth appeared just as the transport was landing, his face flushed with anger. "Colonel Chun, what is the meaning of this? I've just discovered that 3 of our cadets are attempting to leave with you without proper authorization." Sarah turned to face him calmly. "Dean Ashworth, these officers have volunteered for emergency service. Their qualifications have been verified, and they've been accepted for immediate assignment. They're first-year cadets. They have no business in a combat zone. They have more practical combat training than most third-year students. I've personally overseen their education in tactical operations, crisis management, and field leadership." Ashworth's face grew even redder. "That unauthorized training you've been conducting in violation of academy regulations? I knew you were corrupting these students with your frontier nonsense." Sarah stepped closer to the dean, her voice low and dangerous. "Dean Ashworth, in approximately 6 hours, I'll be facing an enemy that has already destroyed 3 human colonies and killed thousands of people. I'll be doing that with whatever resources I can find, including 3 young officers who understand that real combat is about keeping people alive, not following procedure." She gestured toward Torres, Morrison, and Blackstone Vance, who were standing at attention nearby. "Those 3 have learned more about actual military operations in 6 months than most of your graduates learn in 4 years. If you want to file a complaint about my teaching methods, you can do it after this war is over." The transport pilot was signaling for departure. Sarah shouldered her pack and started toward the aircraft, followed by her 3 volunteers. Behind them, Dean Ashworth was shouting something about regulations and proper channels, but his words were lost in the whine of the transport's engines. As the academy fell away beneath them, Sarah looked at the 3 young people who had chosen to follow her into unknown danger. They were staring out the windows at the stars ahead, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and fear that she recognized from her own mirror 20 years earlier. Having second thoughts? She asked. Torres shook his head. No, ma'am. This is where we need to be. Morrison added, you taught us that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. This feels right. Blackstone Vance was quieter, but her voice was steady when she spoke. My family expected me to graduate with honors and receive a safe assignment in the inner systems. They're going to be furious when they find out I volunteered for combat duty. What will you tell them? Blackstone Vance smiled grimly. That I learned more about honor in 6 months with you than in 18 years with them. The transport jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward the frontier where humanity's survival might depend on everything Sarah had taught them about adapting, improvising, and refusing to give up when the situation seemed hopeless. As they traveled through the star-flecked darkness, Sarah began briefing her volunteers on what they might expect to find at Kepler Station. She told them about fleet coordination, enemy assessment, and the harsh realities of combat command. But mostly, she told them about the responsibility they were accepting, the weight of making decisions that would determine whether thousands of people lived or died. The Academy taught you theory, she concluded. The frontier is going to teach you everything else. Stay flexible, trust your training, and remember that your job is to keep as many people alive as possible. Everything else is secondary. Torres raised his hand. What if we encounter situations that aren't covered by any training? Things we've never seen before. Sarah smiled. Then you improvise. You adapt. You find a way to win that nobody expects, including yourself. That's what humans do best. We figure out solutions to impossible problems. The transport shuddered slightly as it adjusted course for the final approach to Kepler Station. Through the viewport, Sarah could see the familiar bulk of the massive space station, its hull scarred from the battles it had survived. But now it was surrounded by the largest fleet assembly she had ever seen. Dozens of heavy cruisers, carriers, and support vessels preparing for humanity's next test of survival. Morrison was staring at the assembled fleet with wide eyes. I've never seen so many ships in one place. You're about to see a lot of things you've never seen before, Sarah replied. The question is whether you can function effectively despite being overwhelmed. That's the real test of everything we've worked on. As the transport approached the station's docking bay, Sarah felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread that preceded every major engagement. But this time, there was something else, a sense of completion, as if the months of teaching and training had been preparation for this moment. Her 3 former cadets were no longer students learning about combat in a safe classroom. They were officers heading into battle with everything she could teach them about survival, leadership, and the terrible responsibility of command. Whether that would be enough to keep them alive in the war that was coming remained to be seen. The transport settled into the docking bay with a gentle thud. Through the viewport, Sarah could see fleet personnel hurrying back and forth, preparing for deployment. In a few hours, this massive force would jump to the frontier to face an enemy that had already proven it could destroy entire worlds. Sarah Chun had spent her career preparing for moments like this. Now it was time to find out if she had prepared her students well enough to survive what was coming.